The storm and winds may.
Hi, I'm Terry Townsend, minister here at the New Concord Church of Christ in New Concord, Ohio. I want to personally thank you for joining us today via this live stream. The purpose of this stream is to simply share the good news of Jesus Christ. While we appreciate you viewing this stream, this effort is in no way intended to be a substitute for the assembling together with the saints. We recognize, however, that there are circumstances that arise that might prevent someone from attending church service. And for this reason, we provide a means whereby people like you can hear the gospel preached. We hope you enjoy today's message from God's Word. Please feel free to share this stream. If you're ever in the New Concord, Ohio area, we'd love for you to drop by and visit with us. We meet every Sunday morning beginning at 9:15 a.m. for Bible class, again at 10 a.m. for worship, and again 6 p.m. for our evening worship. See you soon.
You hold me in your mighty arms, forever safe from harm.
So I just want you guys to know from the outset that I do take short talk very seriously. This is all the length that we'll be covering tonight. So give me about 10 or 15 minutes of your time and attention and we'll be good to go. So when me and Brandon moved back into the area, most of you probably know I started working for the prison, which is a state job. And if you've heard the rumors about state jobs, they're definitely sometimes, most of the time, true, where you don't always have to do a whole lot of work when you're working for the state. As long as you do what you need to be doing, then you'll have plenty of downtime or free time. And I discovered that in my first 3 months on the job. And their mistake was that they only restricted me to 3 hours a day of YouTube. So that was all I was allowed to watch YouTube was 3 hours a day, which was plenty of time for me to get really, really into watching these political videos. If you have talked to my family over here, they can attest that I got so into political videos that it was pretty insufferable. I started looking for the political meaning in everything in life, every commercial, every action, every sentence, just pick it apart and insert politics. And if some of you are like me, if you get on Facebook and you read through the articles, or you click down the rabbit hole and you find yourself 8 pages, 8 videos later about politics, then you know what I'm talking about when I say when you get that wrapped up in something, you start to believe every day like the world is about to end because this one person said this one thing, or because this one law was or wasn't passed, a law that we probably know nothing about to begin with. And you start to get really, really wrapped up and consumed with this idea. And I did that as well. I got really deep into the politics for about a couple months. I'm not cut out for it, by the way. And so then I finally heard someone say that if it's not going to be news a week from now or 2 weeks from now, then why should I care about it right now? And I was like, that's a really good meter to live by. So I tested it a couple times, and sure enough, the things I was super concerned about Monday of one week, I had forgotten by Tuesday of the next. But it still wasn't enough to kind of end my political obsession, to kind of put it to rest or normalize it, I guess. What really kind of sealed the deal for me was months later, a couple months ago, when I started studying actually the story of Pilate. And that kind of helped me put to bed my political hunger, I guess you could say. Most of us are familiar with Pilate by name, at least. Pilate was the ruler, the Roman ruler who kind of sentenced Jesus to death. And so we're familiar with his name. But if you're like me, then when you hear about Pontius Pilate, then you kind of think about a guy who was maybe put in a difficult position, and he made a decision, ultimately not a good decision, but we kind of empathize with him. We kind of think like the Jews came to Pilate, put him in a weird spot. He did what he could to get himself off the hook. So like ultimately he was kind of weak and maybe a little bit cowardly, but we almost want to kind of let him off the hook for that. We almost want to kind of say it's understandable given the spot that he was in. There's several times that Pilate referred to Jesus as King of the Jews, which makes us feel like he maybe understood where Jesus was coming from. There's a couple of times where he took certain actions to try to basically get Jesus out from the target of the Jews. He scourged him and tried to offer like that being enough instead of the crucifixion. He did the whole at the feast, who do you want to be set free? Again, seemingly trying to let Jesus off the hook. So we kind of empathize with Pilate in that way. Something I think that adds to that is that the scriptures don't actually talk a whole lot about who Pilate was. Matthew and Mark have very, very few verses, as well as Luke, very few verses discussing Pilate. The Gospel of John has probably the largest section of Scripture, about a chapter and a half, but even in that section, Pilate is more of a character that furthers the story along. But as I kind of got into studying Pilate a little bit, I realized that Pilate was a real historical figure who really ruled during an actual period of history. He's, like when we are in grade school and reading about Alexander the Great or whatever, that's all I can tell you about him is his name. But I know I read about him at some point. Like, he was a real historical figure, and so was Pilate. Pilate was actually a person. He's not just like a biblical character that we made up. He was a real person whose rule had actual consequences. He was the governor of a Roman province that had a very large Jewish population. Throughout the course of the crucifixion story, he says that he finds no fault with Christ. And it appears like he crucifies Jesus to kind of placate the Jews or to kind of make them happy because there was some tension rising. He does make references to Jesus as King of the Jews. In Mark 15 and verse 5, it even goes as far as to say that Pilate was amazed by Christ, by the resolve that he had in the face of his punishment and his accusers. He kind of approaches the crowd with multiple alternatives to the crucifixion, and so it appears like he's really trying, but he's stuck in a difficult position again. He ultimately seemingly gave in to kind of the wrong sort of pressure is what we think of when we read the story. And it's really easy from where we sit today. We have the advantage of knowing how the story turns out. It's really easy to read back into the story our own motives, especially when there's such a lack of information. But if we look back at the history, I don't actually think Pilate was a weak character. I don't actually think Pilate was this, kind of sort of spineless person who got caught in a difficult position. I think we find that Pilate was actually a very, very cunning political manipulator who really, really crafted a dangerous and lethal situation to bring about the end that he wanted to happen. Some of the other historical factors that Pilate was a prominent governor of one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. You don't get to that position by being weak. You're not going to rise up in a government system by just giving people what they want all the time and just kind of trying to appease people only. You have to show some kind of leadership ability in order to rise the ranks, as Pilate did. During that time, the Jews were taxpayers of the Roman government, but they were also allowed to exist kind of in their own community. So even though they were living under Roman rule, they had their own Jewish community that was pretty homogenous. It was pretty much just them, and they would interact with other people, but the Jews were their own community. So they were allowed to have their own places of worship. They were allowed to have their own education systems, and they even actually had their own judicial systems as well. So they would deal with crimes and punishment themselves most of the time within their community, within their body of governance, Jewish governance. And this is all while they're maintaining the benefits of being Roman taxpayers. So they get the Roman protection, but they have their own small culture within Roman culture. In return for paying taxes, the Jews would then kind of recognize the Roman government, and they would see Caesar as their ruling official, as their king. But the problem with that is that for Romans, Caesar wasn't just a king, he was also viewed as a god. He was a god king. So ideologically, the government of Rome was not just a political, but also a religious body. And so that created a lot of issues with the Jews, because the Jews would acknowledge him from the government side of things, but they were monotheistic. They believed in only one God. So that was a lot of tension for them. From the outset of that arrangement, there was always tension between the Jews and the Romans, because the Jews just wouldn't see it the way that the Romans wanted them to. They would say, like, yeah, Caesar is our ruler, but he's not our God. And to Rome, that was kind of an insult, but they were still paying taxes, so, what are we going to do about that? And in fact, that tension existed from the outset and wouldn't be dissipated until the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem in about AD 70. So all of that while, the tension existed between the Jews and the Romans. And then you add Christ into the mix. And from his birth, Christ was declared a king. And all throughout his life on earth, people were reiterating that he is the king. He's the king of the Jews. So you have this kind of rebellious, sort of unordained king who's now not just a threat to the Jews because he's going to overhaul their entire religious system and way of life, but he's also a threat to the Romans because they have one king and one God, and that is Caesar. In just 3 years' time, Jesus goes from being this unknown guy from Nazareth. Nobody had heard of him really, except for a few prophets maybe. And in that amount of time through his ministry, he becomes a household name in the entire region. Most of the people in that region have heard of Jesus through some form of another, some kind of legend. Whether they have accurate information or not, they have an idea that he exists and that people are claiming he's some kind of king. So in that way, he presents a pretty big threat just to both the Romans and the Jews. So being the Roman governor of that time actually places Pilate in a pretty strange situation, because you've got this tension that has always existed with the Jews, and now the Jews are kind of creating a little bit of an uproar because you've got this third guy coming in who also is rebelling against your system in a way. And so Pilate is in a really weird situation because if you remember, the Roman culture, the Roman Empire valued might. That part of their culture, and I beat this into the teenagers' heads over here, is their culture was a might equals right culture. So if you had the power, the ability to do something, then it was therefore the moral thing to do. So if Pilate didn't act in this situation, then someone would come and basically take his position. He would be removed from office because he was not acting as a mighty or strong ruler. So he has to act, but the way he acts also really, really matters, because if he doesn't deal rightly with the Jews, if he doesn't make the Jews happy in how he acts, then that tension is going to increase. And again, he's going to get pressure from above, from the Roman government, to say, why haven't you kept your province under control? Why is this rebellion escalating, in a sense? So if he doesn't make the Jews happy or placate them in some way, then he's going to have problems. If he does nothing, he's going to have problems. But if he makes himself the person who enacted punishment, then that could make the Christian following all that much worse. That could make him a new target for them, because right now their conflict has just been Jewish-Christian conflict. And he doesn't know a whole lot about this Christianity thing. It's fairly new. So if he makes himself the person who does this, the known enemy, then he could kind of garner all of this wrath toward himself from this new movement that we don't know anything about. Or he could just allow the Jews and the Christians to keep fighting and enter into an all-out religious civil war. So he has to do something. And you can see there's a lot of different ways that he could do the wrong thing and lose what he wants, which is power, political power, prominence, that kind of thing. So Pilate then doesn't see Jesus as necessarily, I believe, doesn't necessarily see Jesus as this innocent man who, like, well, I guess we kind of have to crucify him to make the people happy and keep them calm. I think Pilate actually sees Jesus as a pawn. He is a tool that can be used and maneuvered in order to kind of win this chess match that he's playing. For example, if you look at King of the Jews, the number of times that phrase is used, Pilate uses it over and over again, obviously not because he sees Jesus as a king. Caesar's the king. Caesar's the king that we claim allegiance to. Caesar's the one that grants Pilate power. He's not going to go against that. That's, in my opinion, from what I've read, that's really more of a taunt. Every time he uses that phrase, King of the Jews, Pilate is taunting the Jews because they would hate that. They would despise that, to be associated with Jesus in that way for the threat that he's caused them over the past 3 years. If you look at John chapter 18, verse 13, when the Jews approach Pilate about doing something about Jesus, we have to kind of deal with this problem that's happening. And he says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." Again, it looks on the surface like Pilate is saying, just deal with it yourself. I don't want to be involved. The reality is, the only thing that the Jewish judicial system could not do is capital punishment. It was in Roman law that Roman government had the exclusive right to enact capital punishment. So he's actually putting them in a position to say, we can't deal with him on our own because we're not allowed to do what we want to do to him. So it's not necessarily that he's like stepping back, hands off the situation. It's like, admit that you need me. The Jewish authorities were obviously threatened by Jesus. And so here we kind of see the extent to which they view him as a threat, that they're willing time and time again to submit to Pilate, to admit that they need Pilate to do what they want to be done in the situation. Even though it goes against their religion, even though it goes against their beliefs, to submit to Roman government and admit that Caesar is the ruler and God, they're willing to put themselves in that position because of how much they despise Jesus and how much of a threat he is to them. Another thing about Roman culture is that the Roman governor for a Roman prefect or province was the sole, he wasn't just the sole executive person, he was the sole judicial person as well. So he was the judge and jury. And he was also the person who would preside over religious matters. It was very, very common for the Roman government to have trials, and they seemed like they were promoting justice and fairness, but really most of the time they were show trials. They were mock trials where the governor would enact an outcome that was really, really harsh. And so it was like a theater, and it was for show, to show the citizens, like, if you do this thing, then this really, really, really bad punishment is going to happen to you. And it wasn't really about justice or, the right thing happening. It was about a display of Roman power. And Pilate was the one that was making that final call. He does several things that appear to let Jesus off the hook, like the scourging. So from his point of view, the scourging not only does it show the level of abuse and torture that the Roman government can enact, but it puts the Jews again in a position to say, no, that wasn't enough. We still want more from you. We still need the Roman government to go a step further. So it kind of has that dual purpose. In that sense, the Jewish authorities have to escalate their submission to Pilate and the Roman government one step further. And then ultimately, if you look at the inscription that was put on the cross, it says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And if you look in Scripture where that occurs, the Jews object pretty fiercely to that. They don't want that to be on the cross because that's an affront to them. But Pilate is completely unbending. And that, to me, is kind of one final display of, I did make this happen for you, but I'm still the one that's in control. You still didn't quite get your way. So we see Pilate all throughout making these really, really crafty and cunning political maneuvers to get exactly what he wants to happen, for the threat of Jesus to be eliminated, for the Jews to be at fault, and for the tension to subside. And he gets all of those things in one package, and all he has to do is put an innocent man to death. So it's a win-win for him in his eyes. And if you were a person living in that day and age, I think you would feel a lot like we sometimes feel today, where something happens politically and we think, this is it, this is the thing that's going to push our country over the brink, or this is, the thing that is going to cause us to change too much as a nation or as a people, or this is a shift politically in the wrong direction and now we're not going to be able to come back from this. It would have most definitely felt like that in that moment. Living in that time and understanding the tension that has always been there, and then to see an innocent man, whether you really believed in him or not, to see him put to death, for a lot of people would have felt like that level of darkness, like that level of there's no coming back from this. The evil or the wrong side has won the day. But even in all of that, political maneuvering and cunning and manipulating, God's plan still took root. And the very thing that Pilate sought to kill to achieve more power for himself, and the way he treated Jesus as completely obsolete, as just someone who he could use to fulfill his ultimate goal, Pilate was used in exactly the same way by God, as just a human ruler that could achieve God's ultimate goal of bringing salvation to all men. Regardless of how gruesome it was and regardless of how wrong it was, it still brought about the greatest gift that we could ever ask for. And so to me, that really spoke volumes of how I just don't need to worry about it. I don't have control over it. I don't have the right to be worried about it because I don't have that level of involvement. And ultimately, no matter what it looks like in the day, whether I feel like my side is winning or losing or doing the right thing or betraying their values or whatever, regardless of how I feel about it in that moment, God's plan is at work. And it is going to come to fruition. Whether we believe it or not, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not, God's plan is going to win the day. And so one verse, Romans 13:1, says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." Again, saying that God is the one that is ultimately in control. No matter how much power we feel like we have or don't have in this life, or feel like others have over us at times, God is the one who puts people in power and allows people to stay there. God is the ultimate chess master, and his plan is going to be the thing that happens. I think at one point Pilate kind of challenges Jesus and says, "Do you not know that I'm the one that has authority over you?" And Jesus' response is so perfect because he acknowledges that that's true. Yeah, he has authority over him, but he only has authority because someone has given it to him from above. And Pilate, of course, thinks that he means the Roman government. And ultimately, I think that above was God, that God has the ability to arrange things like that. So if you're here tonight and you feel like stressed on that kind of a level, or maybe things in your life aren't working out the way that you feel like they should or could or would, then take the opportunity to resubmit that to God, get that control out of your own hands, and bring it to Him. Do that as we stand and sing.